Over the years, I've been interested in the case. I've been a big aviation buff for as long as I can remember, and I would, occasionally keep tabs on what was going on with D.B. Cooper as things would come up in the newspaper and so forth. But I've found it frustrating as time has gone by that there is so much conflicting information and obviously bad information. Everything you hear about D.B. Cooper can't be true. So I think that's a natural situation in big cases, whether you're talking the JFK assassination or what have you. There's always a lot of information out there and conspiracy that surrounds it and so forth. I'm one of these people who, strangely enough, is pretty much no nonsense, no BS. Let's focus on the facts. Obviously, some conjecture is required because there are a lot of holes here. But I decided about 10 years ago that I was going to undertake an investigation into the D.B. Cooper case in earnest. And this is how I decided to go about it. I decided that I was going to essentially utilize or implement a 4-point plan. The first part was I was going to focus on trying to establish the facts, which is no easy thing to do in this case. But there are some things that, generally speaking, we can agree upon as far as the facts in the case are concerned. The next part of the process was to focus on some of the newer evidence information that's been developed since 1971, thanks in large part to Tom Kay and the Cooper research team, in particular the evidence with respect to the tie in 2008 as well as 2017. The third part of my plan involved developing a suspect profile. There were a lot of things about Cooper that conflicted me. In one sense, he seemed to be very well-educated, very knowledgeable, and so forth. But then in another sense, there were aspects of his personality that conflicted with that. For example, one of the flight attendants mentioned at the time that Cooper received the ransom that he acted almost childlike and giddy. These are her words to describe him. The fact that this guy who's apparently a successful business person, or at least he's presenting himself in that way, and in some respects, by talking about the plane and so forth, there are things that, there's knowledge that he demonstrated that was above and beyond normal. But here he is tooling around with a $1.50 clip-on tie, he smokes cheap cigarettes, and he has a beat-up attaché case. So there's things that just didn't jive with me. So I needed to rectify that in my mind in terms of establishing a suspect profile. So that was the third thing that I was going to focus on. Then the fourth and final point, and this is a very important point, critical point, I've believed that the FBI probably had actually come across the real D.B. Cooper. We have all heard of the stories of cold case files. The Green River Killer is an example of this. Cold case files that are cracked 30 years later with advances in DNA testing and so forth, only to find out that the culprit was actually somebody who was on the FBI's radar screen all along, somebody who had been there for many years. And given that the D.B. Cooper case had experienced 12, 13, 14, 1,500 suspects, I felt it was very likely that the real D.B. Cooper was actually buried in that suspect information in the FBI files. So I decided what I was going to do after establishing the facts and looking at the new evidence and, of course, establishing a suspect profile. I decided to start going through the FBI files, all released due to the Freedom of Information Act. And I had a very clear idea of the type of suspect I was looking for. So again, I approached this thing not with a suspect in mind and let me try and make the facts fit the suspect. It was exactly the opposite. I knew all the evidence. I knew the facts to the best that anybody could know, I suppose, in this case. And I had a suspect profile, and I was looking for somebody that fit that profile. If there wasn't anybody, then there wasn't anybody. So I started reviewing the FBI files. Right now there's probably, 20,000 pages worth. I've read them all. I've read the entire thing. I've read all of this information. And I eventually came across somebody that struck my eye. And of course, this information is heavily redacted, so I didn't know who the FBI was talking about. But what I did know was that this person was somebody who had worked for Boeing, somebody who was a technical editor for Boeing, which made a lot of sense to me because I knew that somebody, actually let me back up. I knew this person had worked for Boeing. I knew this person had obtained a Department of Defense clearance. I knew this person had graduated from Santa Rosa Junior College in 1949. I knew this person had obtained a journalism/English degree from Mizzou, University of Missouri in February of 1954. And I knew the person actually had a resume. There was a resume included there, so I knew this person was a skydiver, enjoyed hiking, and so forth. I also knew that he fit the metrics in terms of his appearance. I knew he was 6'1", 180 pounds, apparently in good shape. He even mentioned that he was fit, which made sense. So this person was very intriguing for a number of reasons, in part because the journalism degree, and it was actually an English degree. He had tried to get a journalism degree, but he found it to be a little too difficult and ended up getting an English degree. And I also had seen his resume, so I knew that he had worked literally dozens of jobs, 1-2 years at a time, various newspapers and so forth. So I started to suspect that this person worked for Boeing, but probably as something like a technical editor or somebody maybe who worked for the company newspaper, perhaps somebody in their public relations department. But I felt comfortable with this person not only because of the various things that I thought were important, the Boeing experience and the skydiving experience and the physical parameters and so forth, but also I just didn't think that D.B. Cooper was an engineer, making the big bucks or whatever the case may happen to be. I just thought that this is entirely possible that he worked in some other part of the ancillary aspect in the company. I put that aside, actually, and decided, let me go through the rest of the suspects and see if anybody else catches my eye. And eventually I finished that up and nobody did. So at this point, even though I didn't know the person's name, I knew I could probably find it out pretty easily with some research. So I contacted Santa Rosa Junior College and also University of Missouri, requested information related to the graduation years, 49 in the case of Santa Rosa and 54, February of 54 in the case of University of Missouri. And I surmised that if I saw the same name on both of those graduation lists, that's who I would be looking for. Sure enough, I got the information a couple weeks later, and there was the name Sheridan Peterson on both of those lists. So I quickly did an internet search of Sheridan Peterson. It was a name I actually had heard. I was familiar with the name and vaguely familiar with the name. And I found out that he actually had been a suspect or was a suspect on the FBI's radar screen, but one that had largely flown under the radar. I also read and I saw the first pictures of him, which I was immediately struck by the similarities in the sketch, the black hair, the high forehead, everything else. But there were a couple things that stood out to me. One, apparently his DNA had been compared to Cooper's and came back negative, and he also had blue eyes, and Cooper is commonly known as having brown eyes. So I decided to look into this a little bit further. And I also had the great benefit of coming to the realization that Sheridan Peterson, 92 years old, was still alive. So this afforded me the opportunity to pick up the phone and actually call the guy. So to date, I have talked with, texted, and emailed Sheridan Peterson personally dozens of times. The last time I communicated with him was probably 3 or 4 days ago via email. That said, he's not a big fan of me. He doesn't like me too much. I really don't know why. I think I'm pretty charming at times, but for whatever reason, he doesn't like me. So I started digging into the DNA and trying to figure out where this information about Sheridan's DNA, his comparison coming back negative, where this information came from. And eventually, I determined that this information, there's a fly that's bugging me here. I determined that this information originated in an article that Sheridan himself wrote in 2007 for Smoke Jumper magazine in 2007. And I found that very interesting. So I contacted the FBI agent who had interviewed Sheridan Peterson. As it was, Sheridan Peterson Sheridan first became a suspect. Let me put it this way. Sheridan first became a suspect of the FBI within 1 week of the skyjacking. The FBI files actually include the original paperwork, the original contact with the FBI. Somebody at Boeing had contacted the FBI and said, you may want to check this guy out. This was within days of the skyjacking, within 1 week. I also believe there was another person as well, so I think there were 2 contacts with the FBI, on behalf of people saying that we think you should check into Sheridan Peterson. Well, the FBI started checking into Sheridan Peterson. They interviewed his ex-wife who was living in Bakersfield, California, because they couldn't find Sheridan Peterson. They didn't know where he was, so they figured let's go talk to his ex-wife in Bakersfield. And the first thing she said is, yeah, that sounds like something Sheridan could do. That sounds like him. She also said that she didn't really know where he was other than that he's in Asia. He'd been in Asia for a handful of years. So to speed forward here, I found out that the FBI, the first time the FBI actually had an opportunity to interview Sheridan, unbelievably, was 2003. 2003 was the first time they actually had interviewed Sheridan, 32 years after he first became a suspect. Now, I'm not going to get in the weeds with how this happened, but it's clear to me as I've read the memos and documentation from the early part of the investigation into Sheridan, the agent who was handling it was actually transferring to another division. It's referenced in there. The fact that they didn't know where Sheridan was, and quite frankly, the fact that there were a flood of new suspects coming in on a regular basis. Simply put, he just fell through the cracks. The file just got put aside and fell through the cracks. And as the story goes, I'm interviewing the FBI agent, a woman named Mary Jean Fryer, who interviewed him in 2003. Her and her partner interviewed Sheridan in 2003, and she said that the FBI had finally established a DNA profile, a partial DNA profile for Cooper around the year 2000, 2001, something in that area. They were reasonably confident that it was Cooper's DNA because there are 3 DNA profiles on the tie, 2 of which are related to skin cells, one of which is a small dried up saliva sample on the tie, and they figured the saliva sample there's a real possibility that was Cooper's DNA. So they did test it, they did derive a partial DNA profile. And so they were reviewing old suspects around that time, around 2003, and there was one person, and one person alone, that they wanted to talk with and finally interview and take a DNA sample from, and that was Sheridan Peterson. To date, there have been only 3 people, 3 suspects that the FBI has compared the DNA from. One is Dwayne Weber, who his wife famously said that he confessed on a deathbed in 2000, and she's been very vocal and very public and so forth. They finally, I believe, relented and eventually compared Dwayne's DNA, with what we considered Cooper's DNA. Also, L.D. Cooper. L.D. Cooper, of course, is the suspect who first hit our television screens in 2011. His niece, Marla Wynn Cooper, was the person who brought L.D.'s name to the forefront. Again, very public, big splash nationally. The media ate it up, and I think as well there was a lot of pressure for the FBI to actually make that comparison, and then Sheridan Peterson as well. The 2 of those 3 suspects, L.D. Cooper and Dwayne Weber, have been publicly cleared by the FBI. Go on the FBI Redex page, do a Google search. The FBI itself has publicly cleared those 2 suspects by virtue of the DNA. Sheridan Peterson, they have not. And I want to know why. So, and I have looked at this extensively and decided, you know what, I'm actually going to talk to the FBI about this. So I reached out to the FBI, talked with the Seattle division, let them know that, listen, I know that you've publicly cleared these other two people, but you haven't publicly cleared Sheridan. Can you clear him, or what can you tell me about it? And basically they responded, they came back at me and said, due to privacy matters, we can't talk about subjects of the Norjack investigation, which makes absolutely no sense to me, because obviously they have already established a precedent where they have publicly cleared DNA suspects. And by the way, these two gentlemen are dead and presumably couldn't give a damn what their DNA test results were. Sheridan Peterson, on the other hand, is still alive. And they have rebuffed my efforts at every turn to get any kind of information with respect to Sheridan Peterson and his DNA. So I also talked to the FBI agent about Sheridan's claim that he had been told by the FBI that his DNA came back negative. She said that is not true. That is not what happened. She said that she never told Sheridan that the DNA had come back negative. So I quickly realized that the story about Sheridan's DNA not comparing, in fact coming back negative, was in fact false, and in fact it was a narrative, it was a story started by Sheridan himself. And I also quickly learned that this DNA evidence actually appeared to incriminate Sheridan by virtue of the fact that he's the one person that they haven't cleared publicly or privately, as far as I know, and even to this day, they just refuse to discuss anything related to Sheridan Peterson. So that was very interesting. It was a very big piece of the puzzle that I was intrigued to discover that information. The next thing was the blue eyes. There was one other thing I wanted to look at, was the blue eyes, because Sheridan has blue eyes and Cooper has been reported as having brown eyes. I investigated that as well. I realized that there was only one person, Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants, who essentially saw Cooper without his sunglasses at the very beginning of the flight. Before the plane was hijacked, Cooper handed her a note, which she put in her pocket before reading it, because she thought he was making a pass at her. But he kept on looking back at her, and she realized, maybe I should read the note. And at that point, she read the note, and it said, I've got a bomb here, I want you to come sit by me. So at that point, she came, sat next to Cooper, and Cooper issued some demands, and he put his sunglasses on, and from that point, he never took them off. I heard you mention, Tom, something about the glasses coming off throughout the flight. I've seen nothing at all that indicates that's the truth. So there was one person, and she's the one person that said that he had brown eyes, or she believed that he had brown eyes. But I also read in the files later on, when she was working with the sketch artist, that she told him that she couldn't be sure. There was things about their eyes that she couldn't be sure about. And if you go back and you look at the original FBI description of Cooper, it says he has brown eyes, but since that point, they say he possibly has brown eyes. So the FBI obviously is not certain whether he actually has brown eyes. They think he may, but they're not sure. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter, because all I know is the FBI showed up at this guy's door in 2003 and took a DNA sample for some reason. So obviously they were pretty comfortable with testing out Sheridan Peterson. So at this point, I felt very comfortable with Sheridan. I thought that there's an awful lot about him that fit. But like I said, the benefit that I have over most of these suspects is that he's still alive, and he's written quite extensively, and he's actually willing to talk, has been willing to talk. So I did a lot more research, talking with him face to face, or I'm sorry, not face to face, but over the phone, via text, via internet, email, and so forth. And there have been a number of interesting things that have come up in these conversations. Through communication that he had with a friend of his, he was asked how it is that he managed to survive while living in Nepal. I guess I should throw this out there. Sheridan moved to Nepal in August of 1970. He left Nepal in March of 1973. He has two children that were born in Nepal. When the FBI interviewed him in 2003, they asked him, where were you November of 1971? And he summarily stated that I was living in Nepal, never left Nepal, was there the entire time. And he provided his children's birth certificates and so forth as a measure of support to show that indeed he was in Nepal and so forth. And the problem is he couldn't provide anything specific to the November 24th time frame. But nonetheless, he had established, he had told the FBI that he had been in Nepal. One of the things that the FBI asked him about was how he managed to survive financially, because, and there's no dispute about this, Sheridan did not work the 2.5 years he was in Nepal. So here this man is, he's living in Nepal with for 2.5 years with a wife, with a Filipino wife, and 2 children that are actually born there with no job, no income, didn't file income taxes or anything, and the FBI asked about that, and I asked Mary Jean Fryer, the FBI agent, what his response was, and she said he never really gave a satisfactory response. But in a conversation with a friend of his, he was asked the same question, and I can't reveal the name of the friend, but I actually have the information. This was text communication, and I actually have the text. He was asked that same question, and he basically said that he had a numbered bank account that he had opened in Singapore in 1971, which immediately raised a lot of red flags because, first of all, anybody who's familiar with numbered or secret bank accounts, the only reason you open something like this is because you're trying to hide something from somebody. And the FBI agent herself said the only reason you do this is you're trying to hide money from the authorities or what have you. Also, the year 1971 was very interesting, not to mention the fact that when you go to open a numbered bank account, it requires a significant amount of money to open it. In today's dollars, if you went to Switzerland to open a numbered bank account, which is somewhat different today than it was back then, you're talking north of $1 million, to give you an idea of the kind of money that's required to open a numbered bank account. So here's a guy who has literally had dozens of jobs, isn't working for 2.5 years, but he's saying he's living in a mud hut with no electricity and water in Nepal with his family, apparently traveling to a foreign country to open up a numbered bank account. Well, there's a couple problems here. One, again, where do you come up with the money to open a numbered bank account? Why do you do that? The other thing is he destroyed his alibi, because in order to open a numbered bank account, a secret bank account, whatever, you have to leave Nepal to travel internationally to do it. So he immediately destroyed his alibi, which is a very big problem. And I have talked at length with the FBI agent who interviewed him about this. The FBI was unaware of a numbered bank account. She was told that he didn't leave the country. Again, that's his alibi. I was in Nepal. There's no way I could have done this, blah, 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 blah. But again, that is immediately destroyed by virtue of the fact that he opened the account, that traveled internationally, opened the account. Which in and of itself doesn't really prove anything, but it's highly suspect. And I always knew that, looking into this stuff, it was very unlikely that it was going to come up with this smoking gun, that most of this stuff was going to be circumstantial. And what do you expect after 47 years? That's likely going to be the case. But there's also another very interesting comment that he made to the FBI agents when they were interviewing him, which I think comes very close to the smoking gun. There's been an awful lot of controversy about it in Cooper World online and so forth. But when he was interviewing with the FBI agents, they asked him, well, do you think Cooper survived? And of course, Sheridan said no. And they asked him, well, would you have survived? If you had done it, would you have been able to survive? Because again, he's an expert skydiver. And he said, absolutely, no problem. And they asked him why it is that he thinks that Cooper wouldn't have survived. And he made a comment. He said, first off, the dummy reserve, in other words, one of the reserves, you see the smaller parachute, I'll kind of like do a little side note here. When Cooper made his demands, he requested 2 of the larger parachutes, the main parachutes, and 2 of the reserves, the smaller parachutes. He left the jet with one of the mains, the bigger one, and one of the smaller ones, one of the reserves. It just so happens that the reserve that he left with was inoperable, referred to as a dummy reserve, that was accidentally delivered to the airport to him, which is another story in and of itself. But that is the reserve that Cooper left with. And she mentioned that Sheridan stated that the dummy reserve was daisy chained inside. And which to most people hearing that means absolutely nothing. And certainly to the FBI agents, they didn't immediately pick up on it, but as I read it, I actually picked up immediately on it. My obvious question is, how could you have possibly known the way the dummy reserve had been laid out inside unless you actually looked inside? That's a very interesting question, and I asked Sheridan that specifically. How could you have possibly known that the dummy reserve was daisy chained inside? He ignored my question, has never answered that question. And just to explain what I'm talking about here, we're not really sure how the dummy reserve was actually set up inside. We don't know if it actually, I've been unable to confirm that it actually was daisy chained inside. Nonetheless, that's what Sheridan said was the fact. Here's an analogy that I've made as I've talked about this. It's as if the police showed up at your front door one day and said, there was a car stolen in the neighborhood and we want to ask you about it. Obviously they suspect you. And you said, well, no, I didn't take the car, but it had an Alpine stereo system in it. Now, obviously, if you're a police officer interviewing a suspect who's saying they didn't steal this car, never heard about it, but it had an Alpine stereo system in it, the cops, you would think, would say, well, how would you know it had an Alpine stereo system in it? Why would you say that? How would you know that? That's very analogous to what has happened here with the parachute. The police officers don't even need to know whether it actually was an Alpine stereo system. It's just an intriguing point that he mentioned that about the dummy reserve. The reason that FBI agents and law enforcement officials ask suspects questions is because they know if they're guilty, they're likely to say something that they shouldn't. They're likely to slip up. I believe that is precisely what happened here with Sheridan. I believe he slipped up. I think he made a mistake. And I have talked at length with the FBI agent about this. And again, I've also asked Sheridan as well about this. And he has never answered my question, how could you possibly know that? Why would you say that? I've given him ample opportunity and it's never been done. So I think that's a very interesting thing. And again, if it's true, there's only one possible way he could know that, and that's actually to look inside the dummy reserve, and that literally puts him on the plane. Like I said, that's as close to a smoking gun as you're probably going to get here. So the other very interesting thing about Sheridan, let's see my time here. It's easy when I'm sitting over there to see how much time okay. The other very interesting thing about Sheridan, and I'm just touching upon some of the real broad strokes of Sheridan Peterson as a suspect here, is in addition to the DNA and all that other good stuff, when he was interviewed in 2003 by the FBI, they obviously were interested in trying to see if he could establish some kind of alibi. And now you would think that when you're dealing with somebody being accused of actually hijacking a jet, right before Thanksgiving, jumping out and everything else, that you would think that it would be reasonably easy to come up with an alibi in the case of most people. And he's never been able to do it. He's never been able to come up with a satisfactory alibi. A critical part of this pertains to his Filipino wife, the wife that he had 2 children with while living in Nepal. He mentioned, and he's mentioned a couple times publicly, but he mentioned to the FBI that she had passed away about 1977. So apparently she had died 25 years earlier. Well, recently, and this is a very big thing, recently, meaning within the last 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, as I've continued to investigate Sheridan, I had a conversation with his ex-wife, the one that they had interviewed originally in Bakersfield, California. She too is still alive. I was talking with her, interviewing her, talking with her, and I happened to mention something about Sheridan's Filipino wife no longer being alive, which is really unfortunate if you're Sheridan, because she would obviously be a very good alibi. She could provide some information, presumably for Sheridan, exonerating him. Yeah, this is what we were doing, or I can vouch that he was with me in Nepal, or whatever the case may happen to be. Well, unfortunately for Sheridan, she's no longer around, and the FBI can't ask her that. So, but as I'm talking to Sheridan's ex-wife, again, Sheridan's been married twice, as I'm talking to the ex-wife, the first wife, I mentioned something about the Filipino wife no longer being alive, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, my understanding is that she passed away in the late 70s and so forth." And she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. My understanding is she's still alive." And you can imagine how stunned I was to hear this. And as fate would have it, the wife that I'm talking with, the ex-wife that I'm talking with, she has a son with Sheridan who's 62 years old, and a social worker, well-educated guy, lives in the same city. He was actually going to be coming over to his mother's house the next day. So I knew that when he came to visit with his mother, again, Sheridan's ex-wife, that she was going to bring this up to him, because as the wife, her name is Claire, as Claire had relayed this information to me, she explained to me that, yeah, we've had multiple conversations with my son about her wanting to come over from the Philippines. This conversation has taken place also between the son and one of Sheridan's daughters with this Filipino wife as late as 2010. Even she said that Sheridan came to her house and they were talking face to face about 2010, and she was asking about the Filipino wife coming to the United States, and he had mentioned something about, well, the problem is she wants to bring the whole family over. So this obviously was stunning information. So having said that, I knew the older son was coming by the next day, and that they would talk about it. So I gave it a couple days, called Claire up, and Claire confirmed that indeed she did bring the issue up with the son, and the son also was under the distinct impression that the Filipino wife was still alive. So this is obviously a very big deal, because one has to ask the question, in light of everything else that has gone on with Sheridan Peterson, why would he possibly lie to the FBI about his wife, the one person who can provide some kind of information with respect to what was going on during the 2.5 years they were in Nepal? Why would he say that she was dead if she wasn't dead? That is very disconcerting. It's also a felony. You cannot lie to the FBI if he knowingly says she's dead but knows she's alive, even if it's in an informal setting. That is a felony there. So I actually passed this information off to the FBI. This was probably about 3 weeks ago, and as we all know, the case is administratively closed, so I actually expected to get a response saying, "Thank you much, Mr. Ulis. We appreciate your interest in the Norjack investigation, but the case is closed. Unless you find money or parachutes, don't bother talking to us." Well, later on that day, I got a response from the FBI, and she said, "Thank you for the information. I'm passing this on to the investigative team." So, to the best of my knowledge, the FBI is actually looking into this situation with Sheridan's wife, because this is a critical piece of the puzzle. So I think I'm going to kind of ended on that, just a very broad over section of Sheridan Peterson, what he's about. What I'll say is this: Sheridan Peterson is still a suspect today. He's been a suspect for 47 years minus probably 5 or 6 days. To this day, he is still a suspect of the FBI. The eyes and ears of the FBI, in other words, the only agent to actually interview Sheridan Peterson is the Mary Jean Fryer that I referred to. She talked with him twice in 2000, interviewed him twice in 2003. She told me that when she walked out of that interview, the first interview with Sheridan Peterson, that she turned to her partner and said, "We may have just talked to D.B. Cooper." Obviously, that suggests that whatever she was told, whatever Sheridan told her during that interview, didn't convince her at all that he wasn't, D.B. Cooper wasn't involved. In fact, as she explained it to me a couple weeks later, smelling a rat, she actually went back, took up the initiative and went back a second time to interview him further. The FBI actually tasked agents to go to Nepal to actually dig into Sheridan's story about the kids being born there and to dig in his past in Nepal. This is in 2003 that this is all taking place. Also, Sheridan, who had been living out of the country, Sheridan basically finally moved back to the United States in 1999, and of course one has to ask, why would you move away for 4 decades? About the time of the hijacking, or a little bit before the hijacking, but stay out of the country. But he moved to Deer Park, Washington in 1999 when he first came back. He was there for a couple years and then went down to Santa Rosa, California, which is where the FBI met up with him. But they were also investigating his time in Deer Park, Washington. And one other very important thing, Sheridan Peterson himself said that when they approached him, they told him they thought he was D.B. Cooper. They said they think with the way he says it, they think that I'm D.B. Cooper. They told me they think I'm D.B. Cooper. So, of course, I asked Mary Jean Fryer about this. I said, Sheridan says that when you approached him, you actually said that you guys think the FBI thinks he's D.B. Cooper. And the way she responded to me was, well, he was a definite suspect. That's why we went to visit him. Knowing Mary Jean the way that I do, we've had numerous conversations. I took that as sort of a wink and a nod, but she obviously can't really, she's still bound by privacy to a certain degree, so there's only so much that she can say with respect to that. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that, and I don't know if anybody has any questions here before we take a kind of a little break and sort of wrap things up for the day. Yes, sir.
I don't know a lot about evidence or law enforcement practice, but I do know from Montel Williams that DNA evidence is usually, it's not like 50% or something, it's usually like, yes, you are, or you're excluded. So that's generally pretty strong.
Yeah.
And then I also know just from inference that the FBI hates to get beat or fooled or anything like that. So what's your surmise? If they've had good DNA evidence since 2003, why haven't they been really aggressive, arrested him, or done something else to develop the case in the 15 years since?
Yeah, the operative word in your question is good. They don't have good DNA. They have a partial profile. They've said that it's not very good. I actually have asked them, well, what does that mean? Does that mean if you tested a random field of suspects that 50% would match, 25%, 1%? What does it mean? And they refused to answer the question. They refused to tell me exactly how strong that profile is. I know that's a partial profile. Even if it was a profile that wiped out 99% of a random field of suspects, that 1% doesn't even come close to meeting the legal threshold to prosecute somebody in this case. So that's that. What I do know is that presumably it's not worthless. Otherwise, why the hell would they travel down to California to take his DNA? Why would they bother comparing it Why would they send people to Nepal to look into Sheridan? Why would they send people to Washington State to look into Sheridan? So that's as much as I know about that. Yeah, actually, let me go with this gentleman because I know he had his hand up earlier. Yes.
So in your investigation with someone like, presumably at the time with one of those wanted people in America just completed a hijacking, how does one exit the country to get back to Nepal? Was a story that you are...
I actually have no idea, just as I don't know how D.B. Cooper actually showed up at the airport. I mean, we know, I mean, there are a lot, I can't answer that. I don't know how he got there. I don't know how he left. Just as, again, I don't know how D.B. Cooper arrived at PDX that day, but I know damn well that he did. That's irrefutable. So I have some theories with respect to that. Sheridan has traveled internationally extensively. Russia, China, Iran, Papua New Guinea, Hong Kong, Japan. These are places he's lived, actually lived. Vietnam, spent many years in Vietnam, Nepal, the Philippines. So he is very adept at traveling internationally. And he's actually, he's kind of to put it bluntly, he's kind of an asshole. He's very cantankerous. He's a very difficult, and I mean, that's anybody who's communicated with Sheridan, I think, would say, yeah, that pretty much explains the guy. He's very, very difficult to work with and talk to. And frankly, has a lot of issues with the country, with the U.S. military and so forth. You know, that's that. But I will say this, I did actually ask him once, in the context of not him being D.B. Cooper, I asked him, I said, you know, why is it that you think D.B. Cooper actually hijacked the jet? Given the time, 1971, Vietnam, RFK assassination, JFK assassination, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights riots, all that good stuff. And he immediately said for the money. He said it was, you know, he wasn't trying to make any kind of political statement for the money. And I believe that is actually, again, asserting that Sheridan Peterson was D.B. Cooper, I believe was for monetary reasons. Yeah, and again, he didn't work for years and has traveled extensively internationally, which presumably costs a little bit of money, especially with family. So, and I know we had somebody over here that, okay. Yes, sir.
You know, Peterson's fingerprints have ever been compared to...
They have been compared. I haven't heard anything about the results. I know that the FBI, kind of like the DNA, they're not really sure if they have fingerprints of D.B. Cooper or not. They've got several partial prints that they lifted off the magazine cover and these kind of things, but they did take his fingerprints at the same time they took the DNA. Yeah.
I really love all your information. Never heard any of this before today. Have you considered, I just heard this about a minute ago, that the most fun I've ever had with D.B. Cooper is at the Ariel annual party. I don't know if you've been to that Ariel annual party where the FBI thought he definitely landed, so they have a there with an annual party. And could it be perhaps that maybe this guy's first wife's kid, his son, the original marriage, could have been old enough to do this hijacking, maybe?
Well, he's 62 years old, so that would be well out of the, 62 minus 42, he had to be 15, so I'm pretty sure they wasn't 15, so at the time, if I'm doing my math right here, yeah, 15. Yeah, so, yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
This Sheraton guy is supposedly your suspect.
Yes.
How old is he now?
He's 92. Yeah.
Well, that would have put him about 45.
He was 44 years old at the time of the hijacking. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. No, there's no fingerprints that they got off the ticket of the airport. Yeah.
Again, I might be rehashing this, but
Yeah.
how did he get to the airport and how did he get away once he landed?
Well, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes here, the short and tall of it is I don't know, but let me just throw out a quick theory here. I highly suspect that D.B. Cooper initially intended to parachute in the outskirts of Seattle. And there are a couple of reasons that I highly suspect that. I tend to believe that, well, let me put it this way. it is safe to assume, it is reasonable to assume that when D.B. Cooper stepped on that jet at PDX 47 years ago, he wasn't absolutely certain, he wasn't absolutely committed to hijacking the jet until he stepped on board. He was essentially the second to the last person to walk on board the jet. There was one person that came in behind him who was running very late. Presumably, if when he entered the jet, he entered through that, they actually loaded the jet from the same back stairway that Cooper later departed. Presumably, if he would have walked on board the jet and there were people sitting already in the back row, the first set of rows you actually walk by, presumably he would have called it off. He would have just sat down and somewhere in the middle of the plane and finished the flight to Seattle and walked off the jet. Now, bearing in mind that he had no additional luggage, change of clothes, or anything else like that with him, I think that he probably already had something set up in Seattle, a motel room or something, a home or something already up there where he'd get a change of clothes or whatever. So if he had to abort the attempt, he'd just walk off the plane and try another day. Also, given that once this hijacking was underway, he requested that when the plane departs Seattle that the stairs already be deployed, which indicates to me that his plan was to immediately jump out of the jet. You know, after they took off from Seattle in the suburbs, the stairs would already be down. His plan was to depart the jet pretty quickly. So again, if he was planning on departing 20, 30, 40 minutes later, then presumably he wouldn't want to, he wouldn't bother having the stairs lowered at the time the jet took off. It also helps explain a couple of other things. We've made a lot of hay, or people have made a lot of hay about the fact that he didn't provide any kind of flight path or plans or directions or anything along those lines. And I would argue the reason why is because he didn't give a damn. He knew he was jumping out in the outskirts of Seattle. He knew the jet was going to Reno, and frankly, he didn't care whether it went to Cle Elum or it went over the ocean or whatever the case. It didn't matter. He didn't need to coordinate with anybody. He knew he was jumping out over the outskirts of Seattle, which, again, coincidentally, he would end up in the same place if he had to abort it in Seattle, and he could, easily go to his hotel room or motel room or whatever the case may happen to be. And I also think it's very important to consider that he had no change of clothes with him. So, obviously, it stands to reason that, once he leaves the jet, that he, probably wants to change clothes as soon as possible. He doesn't want to be dressed up as D.B. Cooper. So I'm assuming that he had something, again, already set up, a place to go to change. I'm assuming that his plan wasn't to go to JCPenney dressed as D.B. Cooper to buy a change of clothes immediately after hijacking. It just doesn't make sense doing it that way. So for that reason and some others, I suspect that he initially intended to jump over Seattle. There are two reasons why he didn't. He got held up. One, because the bank bag, the money the bag came in was chock full. It wasn't a knapsack, so he had to improvise and figure out a way to secure it. And also the fact that the pilots actually refused to take off with the air stairs down, so they had to be lowered after the jet took off, which there was a little bit of a delay. There were some problems with respect to that. And obviously that jump window over the exurbs of Seattle came and went very quickly, and I think by the time he was actually ready to jump, it was just too late. And I suspect that as he got close to Vancouver in particular, he decided to jump here, and that essentially the suburbs, the exurbs of Vancouver, Portland was a suitable alternative to the original plan of the exurbs of Seattle. So, any other questions there?
Question.
Yes.
Do you know if anybody's ever taken off in a 727 rear door deployed, like we talked about in Asia, they practice jumping? And I want to tell everybody that in Portland, a guy lives in a 727 airplanehome.com, Bruce Campbell, and he'll let y'all visit anytime he's home, so you can look at airplanehome.com and Bruce Campbell. But has that happened before?
I know that they did a lot of testing with the air stairs down. I don't know I know that they removed them and then they tried them with the stairs down. I don't know if they were actually deployed and dragging along the runway. Presumably they wouldn't be, but part of the testing of these airplanes is to actually have the tail end hit the ground on purpose. You'll see runway tests where it's sparks and so forth are shooting. So it could have handled it. Yes, sir.
Here's video of the last days of Saigon in 1975 with 727s taking off from Da Nang and Tonson Airport with the rear ramped deck.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're in fact, there's a, if you look up, there's, I cannot think of the guy's name, but this guy, against the orders of his company, he flew back into Vietnam several times to pick up people in the last days. It shows people running up the ramp, and the ramp finally going up.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I haven't heard of that. So I guess that answers the question as far as that goes. So if there aren't any additional questions, my thoughts here were to maybe take a quick break for 10 minutes or so. Then I kind of wanted to convene sort of a panel discussion here and get some audience engagement for a 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And then got a few giveaways, give away a few items and go from there. By the way, I should plug myself on this. My investigation, I ended up publishing it on July 3rd. It's in the form of a PDF on my website, which is thecoopercase.com. So if you go to thecoopercase.com, it's a 135-page report on my investigation. It specifically pertains to how I arrived at Sheridan Peterson and everything revolving around him. So if that's it, how about we take a break for 10-15 minutes and see about getting some people together up front here to convene kind of a panel discussion and then go on from there. Great, thank you.